Welcome to The Plant Report, a radio show that educates about the green world one plant at a time. The Plant Report is a new educational resource about plants, herbal medicine, ethnobotany, and the human-plant relationship. Listen to our podcast, read our blog, watch our videos, and learn from experts and the plants. The Plant Report is a project of Sustainable World Radio and is hosted by Jill Cloutier. Thanks for listening to The Plant Report because every plant has a story. Our guest today is Byron Joel, horticulturist, permaculture designer and teacher, and a practitioner of eco-agricultural regeneration with a focus on Mediterranean climate regions. Byron is the founder of Oak Tree Designs in Perth, Australia. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, Byron. It's great to talk with you today.
Thanks for having me, Jill. Yeah, it's good that we eventually managed to catch up without all the technical difficulties and sleep.
Yeah. Yes.
Or lack thereof.
This is take 3 for those who don't know. I think there was a big storm, then it was the sleep, and now here we are. So let's knock on wood that we continue on.
Yeah.
So we're going to be talking about oak trees today and the importance of oaks. And can you tell our listeners the Latin name of oaks, and then we'll just kind of dive into this topic.
Sure thing. The Latin name for oak is Quercus. And then within the genus of Quercus, there's about 800 species, give or take.
Wow.
From all around the world, mostly the Northern Hemisphere, but I believe there may be some that go past the equatorial line in Mexico. And once upon a time, there was the Lithocarpus genus, which is a very closely related genus in the Fagaceae family in Southeast Asia and China, which is kind of like a tropical, subtropical oak, which is really interesting for people to look into. So yeah, they're all around the world, in the Northern Hemisphere at least, and now they've been taken all around the world in the Southern Hemisphere to Antipodean lands like Australia and South Africa and South America with colonial movement. And they're one of my favorite. They are my favorite tree in the world. And there's a fair few to choose from.
Well, you named your business Oak Tree Design, so I figured it was important to you. And I know you grew up shaded by an oak, 100-year-old oak, I believe, in Perth, Australia.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
was being close to that tree part of what kind of initially inspired your fascination and appreciation for oak trees?
Yeah, indeed. And I wonder, I'm not exactly sure what it was, but I mean, in Australia where it's dominated by eucalyptus and other Australian native trees, which are famously kind of tough and hard and fire or pyrophytic, they burn really well. In fact, they're designed to burn. Whenever you have a big, beautiful, old, established, lush, deciduous tree from the Northern Hemisphere, it kind of stands out. And this old English oak, we called it an English oak. It may actually have been a hybrid, I assume it was, but big, deciduous, leafy green English oak in my yard. It just had this huge presence. It was kind of like the totem entity of the house in which I grew up in. And I just, it kind of marked the seasons of that house. It obviously lost its leaves in the winter time, and it had its catkins burst out in spring, and then its beautiful leafy green growth in the late spring, and the kind of parasol that it would create in the summertime and shade the whole place. And then in late summer and autumn, the acorns would start falling, and the character, there's such character in those acorns with their little caps on them, and all the little seedling oaks that would pop up in the garden. And it's funny, I've never seen it happen before, but that tree, it would be like 1 in 1,000 or so seedlings would be pure white. Like the leaves would be pure white and the stems would be pure white. And some of my earliest memories is of my dad just as baby boomer men seem to obsess over just raking leaves constantly. They just can't handle the idea of a single leaf being in the wrong spot. So it drove him nuts. In fact, I think it's half the reason he sold the place.
It's interesting the different relationship that you had with the tree and then your dad.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And I remember saying to it one day when I was probably about, I don't know, 5 or 6. I remember actually vocalizing that. I said to it something along the lines of, I think you and I have some work to do together. And it kind of gives me goosebumps to look back on that. I don't know what I did or didn't know or didn't feel, but it came out of my mouth. And it kind of stuck with me, and it has become like my own emblem, my own totem for what it represents, everything that it signifies.
That's a wonderful, wonderful description of that tree and your relationship with the tree.
I don't know how it felt about me.
Well, it's probably like that's the guy that doesn't break up our leaves and
Yeah.
seedlings. We like him. So you mentioned a bit where oaks are found around the world, and
Yeah.
can you describe to our listeners what are some natural oak habitats?
There's a kind of a band of temperate latitudes in the northern hemisphere. So it would probably be like from 30 to 40 degrees latitude to something like down to 25, something like that. Anyway, so all the way from far Western Europe in the UK, they've got the famous English oak, and that's a very moist, temperate, non-brittle climate. Although that English oak seems to be very, very happy to grow in Mediterranean climates as well, and very closely related to and similar looking to other deciduous Mediterranean type oaks like the Canary oak and those kind of oaks. And then you get these different forms of deciduous oak in Europe and Asia that are all very similar to each other in lots of ways, and they kind of just run along this temperate band. And they change, of course they change in species, but they hybridize readily. So a lot of the time you get this kind of, instead of just like a hard boundary between two species of oak, you'll get like a blurring of genetics in between them. But then there are also the species of oak that grow in the relative drylands. So, for instance, one of my favorite things in the world, which anyone who's ever heard me rant about anything will be sick of hearing about, that's the Dehesa in Spain. So the Dehesa or Dehesa systems, or Montado systems in Portuguese, is 4 million hectares of semi-domesticated oak savanna in Spain and Portugal, and a little bit in Greece, I believe, as well. And those oak overstand a grassland upon which agriculturalists run their stock animals, and then they will grow certain crops within the pasture land as well. But largely, it's for the raising of stock animals. Cattle, in fact, the merino sheep, which is so famous in Australia, is native to that region of Spain, from the Dehesa. The oak species there are Quercus suber, which is the cork oak, which is famous for its bark, its thick, spongy bark, which is most commonly known as to create the corks in wine bottles, which has been phased out obviously in the last 10 or so years with the screw top bottles. But cork has a million other applications, and I believe it's making a comeback. Anyway, the cork has plenty of applications like flooring, and they make a kind of faux leather out of it for bags and clothing and stuff.
Oh my gosh, it would be great to replace pleather with cork.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be huge. Like, I think Cork Products one big marketing push away from making a serious comeback.
Cork flooring is amazing. I don't know if anyone's ever walked on cork floors.
Yeah,
I worked
you
at a
got that
green
balance.
living store probably 20 years ago, and they were selling cork tiles, and it's so quiet and nice and soft and peaceful.
Yeah, and insulation for roofs, and I mean, I've got a video somewhere on my hard drive where I drove through the world's largest cork plantation in northern Morocco, and so there's a lot of these systems kind of sitting around dormant. And I wrote a post about this just the other day that in the global financial crisis of 2008, to 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 deal with to fight back from the economic conditions they found themselves in, Spain and Portugal got very, very creative with, investing in and augmenting certain industries. And one of them was the eco-agricultural tourism. And they rebooted the Dehesa. They rebooted their commitment to land stewardship for the Dehesa. So they kind of protected it and established maintenance programs, and now they're rebooting their cork economy. And I mean, this system has so many extra yields of honey and quality high quality premium animal products. I mean, the pork that comes from these systems from where the pigs eat the acorns is, I believe, the highest priced animal food product in Europe, below beluga caviar. And honey, and then the whole ecological aspect, like hiking tours and bird watching and hunting, and then the agricultural, like foodie tourism of people coming to see the old traditional methods of doing this and that. So yeah, that's really promising, and it's part of the Rewilding Europe program where they're fostering the breeding of Iberian lynx. I mean, these systems are just to die for. If people want to see a really beautiful video on my website, there's a tab. Sorry, in the articles section of my website, which is oaktreedesigns.com.au, there's an article called Dehesa Australis, and near the top of that article, there's this video, and it's a kind of 5-minute clip of just drone footage and whatnot of the Dehesa, and it's very, very beautiful. It's what I would like every agricultural landscape to look like, give or take.
And so basically the Dehesa then, if I'm getting this right, because I haven't really heard of it until I did some research for this interview. So is it like a semi-domesticated kind of
Mm.
savanna landscape where you're working with the trees that are there, or do you plant the trees, or how does that work?
Well, that's right. So it's
Hmm.
semi-domesticated because of its scale. It's so damn huge. The management of it becomes very hands-off. You can't intensively manage 4 million hectares. So it does become semi-domesticated, it's semi-wild. So it's used for humans use it, but it is semi-wild as well. And it's semi-wild when you have apex predators like, I know they have lynx. I don't know if there's wolf or bear or anything in there. I don't think there's bear in the Iberian Peninsula, except maybe through the Pyrenees, but that's a different discussion. But yes, so it's thousands of years old. They've done different pollen research, and they realize that it's been around in some form for, I think, 4,000 years. And I think once upon a time there was more like the grapes growing there, and there was more this and less that. But it's been in something like its current form on and off for 4,000 years, I believe, if I remember correctly. I'll pause quickly to point people to a really great book called, if anyone's interested in oak, this is like the quintessential oak nerd book with like a really great balance of science and narrative and just interesting historical tidbits. It's called Oak, the Framing of Civilization, by a chap called something Logan. I've gone blank, but I'll look
Mr.
it up.
Logan.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good title. It encompasses a
Yeah,
lot.
it's yeah, and it really does go into amazing detail about oak all the way back to the beginning. Um, so yeah, the Dehesa, they manage it largely. It's the management is the way the animals are moved through there has a lot to do with how it's managed. You know, in a kind of holistic management and intensive rotational grazing way, it's so big that they can move animals through in a certain way that allows the grasslands to recover. And then there is management of the cork system. So I believe a cork tree will start yielding after about 15 to 20, 25 years, and they harvest the bark on a 9-year cycle. There's wildfire, which is a natural occurrence in all Mediterranean climate regions and has been a part of fire stick agricultural, the land stewarding techniques of traditional peoples in many places around the world. And I believe that it's used as a management tool currently. And then there's to allow for the regeneration of oak. I believe there's these. In fact, I'm ordering some in now. I'm in talks with this company in Spain about setting up a trade partnership to get them to Australia. They're called protector cactus tree guards, and they're awesome. They're like a galvanized steel cage with spikes sticking out, so the stock animals don't go anywhere near it, and allows these baby trees to grow into big trees happily. And then you can like lift them up so the bottom is exposed, and then the stock animals will do all the like weed whacking and lawn mowing around the bottom, and they're really neat. I like them.
And so is this something that it's mostly oak, that the Dehesa is usually an oak kind of
Oh,
woodland, or is it other
well,
trees as well?
I mean, in terms of the canopy, the established canopy. I mean, first let's start off with savanna. Like, so what is the biome of the Dehesa? It's a savanna. So a biome is the name we give to describe certain ecological communities and the dynamics that they create. And you can have the same biome around the world with different species. Look, so like a desert is a biome, and there's plenty of deserts with different species around the world, but they've got characteristic similarities. And wetlands are biomes, et cetera, et cetera. So the savanna is a grassland system
Mm-hmm.
which is forested very lightly. So anywhere from kind of like a tree every 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 meters. So that's about like, I think eight trees a hectare or something like that. And savannas are often the result of an environment where you have a strong trophic, where your trophic levels are all occupied, up to the point where you have large grazing herbivores and the predators that prey upon them. So I won't go too far into how it gets there, but it does. And a good example would be the savannas of like the Serengeti in Africa, where you've got these big grass plains, and then you've got acacia trees popping up out of them. So the Dehesa is the savanna of grasslands overstood by oak species. The cork we've spoken about. The other one is Quercus ilex, which is the holm oak, which in many ways is very similar to the cork, but it doesn't have that bark. But they're both evergreen oaks, and they've both got kind of prickly leaves. Quercus ilex has particularly prickly leaves, and ilex is the Latin name for holly. And so their leaves actually resemble the prickly holly leaves. Those two trees, they represent the vast majority of the climax canopy species in that savanna system. There may be others. I'm not familiar with them, if there are, in terms of the canopy species, but there's plenty of understory. Like, it's a whole it's a whole more or less complete ecological trophic system with your, I mean, savannas are characteristically, the two standout features are the canopy trees, lightly stocked, overstanding the rangelands, the grasses, but also you've got all like the shrubs and herbs and everything else growing as well. So there is a real understory
So
going on.
layers of plants.
Correct. And it's worth noting as well that the type of trees that oaks are, they need a kind of successional, they need to pop, they only grow where they can grow, right? So it's rare to see an oak seedling, an acorn just germinating way out in the middle of a field somewhere, and then surviving the weather and surviving the animals and growing into a big climax oak. Often but not always, they require a bit of a nursing environment where a squirrel or a jay or something will take an acorn from an oak tree and into the shrubs, some perhaps prickly species of little acacia or some other shrub, where it makes its home, and then the acorn gets forgotten and it gets covered in duff, and then it germinates, and it's in this great little nursing environment. It's relatively moist, it's relatively free from winds, It's got shade for the summer, and by the time it's big enough to pop its head out from beneath the cover of its shrubby nursery, its roots are really well established, and it can go for it. Then it just takes off.
It sounds so cozy.
Doesn't it though?
It does.
In the Dehesa, it's funny because it's semi-domesticated. You get a kind of the human management errs the system in a certain direction. So while you do have oaks next to each other or within proximity to each other, they are spaced further apart. And while you do have oaks coming up within communities of these kind of understory plants, it's tidier than that usually. So yeah, there's a lot of different oak, so they can all do very different things.
So the Dehesa, is that something that you think could be replicated in different Mediterranean, I would assume Mediterranean climate zones around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is being, at the bottom of that article I wrote, there's a bunch of links to the work of Dr. Ima Fare with this West Australian Agricultural Department. She's a doctor of agronomy, majoring in cereal production, and she's Spanish, and she went and initiated a trial for Dehesa. So while it's very slow going, it has been planted and started, and it's in the system, so to speak, which makes it way easier to then maneuver and leverage. There's a really good PDF available out there. I can't remember the actual title of it. I do have it on a hard drive somewhere, but it's a research paper with about 5 or 6 different authors, but it's about using endemic Californian oak savanna woodlands to recreate a Dehesa-like model in California. That's one of the best publications on the Dehesa I've found.
Maybe you could send me a link to that, or I could upload the PDF.
Yeah.
So the more you're talking about this, the more I'm reminded of Tending the Wild, that book where the California Native Americans tend the wild.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in many places around the world, the Americas and Australia included, when European colonial forces arrived, they didn't have the eyes to recognize the systems they were looking at, because it was just so removed from what they called agriculture. And when Europeans got to California for the first time, they found the Native American Californians eating acorns a great deal, and it was actually considered to be the last great balanoculture. Balanoculture or balata culture is describing the culture of people who live off oak mainly, or in part. And once upon a time, if your genetic heritage is from the northern hemisphere, whether it's Europe or even North Africa, Asia, North America, then you are pretty much, you're genetically programmed to eat acorns. Like it's I consider oak, and this is the thing, like this is the connection. Acorns are human food. It's like, so far as we are designed to eat anything, we're designed to eat oak. That's what we do. And can you imagine the bounty? Anyone that's seen a full-grown oak tree, particularly in a big mast year, bumper crop year, how much fruit it throws off. I mean, it's tons of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins.
Interesting. Most people I know do not think of acorns as something that they would eat. Tell us a bit about why you think acorns are a really viable food crop.
For a number of reasons. I feel like we are genetically aligned to do so. I mean, Europeans at least. I mean, Homo sapiens is conventionally agreed to have been in Europe for the last 50,000 years. So for however many thousands of years we were there, we were eating acorns up until we started farming grain. And even before that, before Europe, we were Middle East and North Africa, and there was oak around as well. So there's that. And then the fact that they are before when I mentioned that oak have become my kind of personal totem. Traditionally in symbolism, they represent robustness and abundance, and they are exactly that. They're incredibly robust and they're incredibly abundant. They're forthgiving with their yield of acorns. So that's the whole discussion of perennial food crops, and in particular perennial staple crops. So very quickly, a staple crop is a type of food that an organism needs the most of, bulk, to survive. And for humans and most omnivorous mammals, that's carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. That's just what we need bulk of to get by. Carbohydrates for fuel, fats for another type of fuel, and because certain micronutrients and whatnot are only fat soluble. And then what was the other one? Proteins, which our body uses as just the raw building blocks of tissue. And so in our world, we have this kind of like monolithic industrial scale agriculture, and we grow our staple crops like corn and maize and wheat and other grain crops, barley and oats and rice in the east. And they're all annuals. And annual crops, they're quite energy expensive because every year you've got to till the soil and weed the soil and then plant the seed and then nurse the seed, and then it grows, and you may or may not get the right rains at the right time, and then you harvest it and you thresh it and you da-da-da-da-da-da. It's a pretty expensive exercise.
High maintenance plants.
It's a high maintenance plant, yeah, throughout its entire life cycle. And it's also ecologically degrading, at least the way we do it. But anyway, the beauty of the oak tree as a prime example of a perennial staple crop is that, and this is indicative of most things that are of any value, they are expensive to establish, economically or ecologically expensive to establish. To establish an oak tree, you have to baby it somewhat for the first however many years of its life. You put the oak in a pot or in the soil, and you've got to water it, and you've got to protect it from animals, and maybe a bit of a windbreak, and then in summer it might need a little bit of an extra watering. Maybe you repeat that for the first few years. And if you're trying to establish hundreds or thousands of these things, that becomes quite time consuming and resource consuming. But once they're established, and with an oak, depending on species and environment, that may be anywhere from 2 to 5 years. Once they're established, they're incredibly robust. Their roots are deep in the soil. They withstand winds, and many of them are resistant to wildfires and what have you. And then once they're in adulthood and they start fruiting, they are incredible. They just drop tons of food, and they have this 2 or 3 or 4 year cycle. They call them a mast cycle, or a bumper crop, some people call it, where they for like 2 years they'll drop their acorns as normal, and then every kind of third or so year there'll be this huge flush of fruit where you'll get like triple what they would normally, and that's an enormous quantity of food. And they do that to kind of to throw off and regulate the populations of the animals that feed upon them, like squirrels and jays and stuff. So then in those kind of systems, you have these very, very robust, stable, huge plant species that need virtually no maintenance or management after that, dropping tons upon tons of high quality staple food every year.
When you put it that way, it makes total sense. But can you eat any acorns raw? You have to prepare them, right, and leach out tannins, I believe.
That's right. So it's a question of the tannins, I believe. That's about it. So tannins are hydrocarbon, a family of hydrocarbon molecules, very common as secondary compounds in plants. I think they're used to deter herbivory, and they've got some like immune functions for the plant and whatnot. But when a mammal eats too many tannins, I believe it inhibits the digestion of proteins and becomes toxic. Some animals can handle more than others, like a pig can handle a fair bit. And in fact, most animals benefit from some percentage of tannins in their diet, but it's very low, around the 1% mark, I think. So so virtually all acorns need some degree of processing, and it would involve something along the lines of collecting the acorns, roasting them, shelling them, crushing them, and then leaching the crushed acorn in fresh water for a few days so that the tannins, which are water soluble, leach out. And once you've done all that, you're left with a meal or flour that's very, very edible and has a lot of energy in it.
It sounds like you've tried this flour. What does it taste like? I've never tried it.
Yeah, I've tried it. It's kind of renowned for being very tasteless. So it doesn't have a whole lot of flavor, but it was used as like a thickener in soups, or to make cakes, and you'd add salts or honey or sweetener or something. But what it is also famous for is being really full of energy. And all the anecdote, I don't know what scientific studies have been done with like the slow release GI of the carbs and starches or whatnot. I'm not sure about any of that. I'd be interested to know. But all the anecdote that I've heard and my personal experience is that you can eat some of this stuff and it'll keep you going for a very long time. Like it's light. It doesn't make you feel over full or heavy like if you ate cake or something, but that it'll keep you going for ages. In fact, it's suggested that... Have you ever read Lord of the Rings?
Yes.
You've probably seen the movie. Most people have, yeah.
Read the books too.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, me too. There was the elven bread. So when the hobbits went through Lothlorien, they were gifted a bunch of things by these elves, including these elven breads or elven cakes, and they were very light and crumbly, and they were full of energy and kept them going all day. And I've read that it's suggested that Tolkien was actually making a reference to oak bread through that.
Love those
Yeah,
books.
yeah. If it's good enough for Galadriel, it's good enough for me.
So acorns then they're reliable, abundant, and are they storable? Do they store well if you have this
Yes,
huge crop?
they do. And yes, that's right. From my understanding, okay, so back to the tannins. There are within the oak genus, the Quercus genus, there's all these different species, and the tannin levels of the acorns throughout those species varies a lot. And then it can also vary within species of different varieties. In fact, like part of the Dehesa Australis project is about recognizing all of the best tree crops for Dehesa analogs. And within the oak genus, that's looking for good species of oak that are precocious and that they have a high yield and they're hardy and and the ones that are low tannin. There are rumors of these oak species or particular trees or varieties within a species that are so low in tannins that you can just pick up an acorn off the ground and eat it like a chestnut.
Wow.
So there's like a collection of acorns. Like my kind of top 5 low tannin acorns are from Quercus ilex, the holm oak, Quercus suber, the cork oak, Quercus bicolor, the swamp white oak, Quercus alba, the white oak, and Quercus macrocarpa, the bur oak, and not in any particular order. The final thing with tannins is that yes, you can store them, and my understanding is that the indigenous peoples of any Bolano cultures, they would prepare the acorns of the species with low tannins in that season, and then they would store the acorns of higher tannin species for seasons to come, because tannins are also a preservative. So the higher tannined acorns would be stored in caches, and packed in mud or clay and stored underground in a cool place. And occasionally you find, you have archaeological digs and they'll find caches of acorns, through the Americas and Japan and Korea. A couple of years ago, there was these big acorn caches discovered in Korea. Yeah,
It's fascinating.
it is.
I know oaks are long lived, so what a valuable food crop if you have this tree living for hundreds of years.
Well, that's where, I feel like my personal totem is the oak tree because of its abundance and its robustness and all of this, these values that I really value. And then I realized that the oak savanna, the Dehesa, like to have an entire broad acre landscape established to oak savanna, that's kind of totemic and symbolic toward the kind of human environment I want to help create, or at least I just want to see, I want to be in, I want to live in that kind of place or close to it. To have those kind of systems are the very kinds of systems that embody the wisdom of a people that gets its foundations right first and thinks ahead in multi-generational terms, and and they're just beautiful as well.
Mm-hmm.
These semi-domesticated places, I've spoken about this before, that to me it's like I don't want to be. I'm not a very urbane dweller. Like I don't like being in cities, but I don't like being in wilderness for too long either. Like that's not our home. That's not where we're from. Humans are a keystone species, and we create our environment. We affect it, like the way a beaver does. It actually creates its own environment in a way, and in doing so has a beneficial and quite pronounced trickle down effect on the environment around it. Well, we're the same. It's just that we've forgotten regenerative principles. So the human impact on the environment doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be incredibly positive, so long as we remember these regenerative principles. And the landscapes that we create when we do that are by default they feel good, they look good. That's where we want to be. And the Dehesa is like the Dehesa as a semi-domesticated broad-scale oak savanna, to me, is just the perfect example of that. It's like a human environment that still incorporates the best of wilderness.
And it's the best of humans too, right? Applying our impact to something that is life-giving and regenerative.
Correct, yeah, agreed.
And how long do oak trees live usually? I'm sure it's a range.
Some of the larger trees, you can live for hundreds of years. And if you coppice them, it extends their lifespan as well. And because in England, England is an island, they had to manage their forestry systems very, very well. They recognized relatively early that they had finite forestry resources. So they developed these systems like the hedgerow systems, where their land was partitioned off from one another. Each parcel was partitioned by a hedgerow, which was like a living fence of all different species that would provide all sorts of yields, including firewood and food and whatnot. Although the history has more to do with the church and whatnot. But anyway, the other systems are like the coppice agroforestry systems, rotational coppice systems, where you'd have like a stand of forest, and you'd have 8 or so oak per hectare, and they would be grown to these big, beautiful, tall saw logs. And then underneath them, you'd have chestnut coming up, and underneath them, you'd have something else. And they were all worked together in this beautiful coppice system, mosaic rotational coppice system. And doing so, the coppicing of those trees somehow extends their life. It kind of hits a reset button, and you can have a tree growing 5 times older than it would otherwise.
So that would be a really valuable technique to replicate.
Oh, we should be paying more attention to it. And I'd point people toward the work of Ben Law, who wrote the book The Woodland Way and other associated releases. He's a coppice chestnut. A coppice worker, a forestry worker, traditional technique on a chestnut plantation in England.
So, Byron, what about medicinal uses of oak? Do you know what part of the tree is used medicinally, and tell us a bit about that?
It's the tannins, it's mostly the tannins. I don't know about the medicine so much, but oak were said to be this tree that yields 3 fruit. And so you got the timber and the 3 fruit of the oak. So the 1 fruit obviously is the acorn, but then the second fruit are the gall of the oak.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you've got these galls, which is kind of like a plant's response to a pathogen, like an insect or a wasp or something laying its eggs in it. It's almost like scar tissue that builds up around the infection. And in oaks, these galls become highly concentrated with tannins, and so much so that they were used for extracting tannins, and they were also used for creating ink. So they had this kind of black, dark ink that they would use to write with their quills. I should also add as well that there are other species of acorn, like the Quercus macrolepsis, which is really interesting. People should check that out. The Quercus macrolepsis. Have a look at the cap on the acorn. It's this incredible. It quite clearly shows the potential of its relationship to a chestnut. So it's kind of like a big spiky burr, but the spikes aren't sharp. They're kind of flat. But it's funny because the macrolepsis acorn is one of the best low tannin acorns as well. I should have added that to my list earlier. But the cap is so high in tannins that it was used to leach tannins to tan leather and whatnot.
That's amazing. And I know oak galls too. I'm actually collecting some, or was, and you can use them for natural dyeing
Mm,
and as a mordant. So it helps the
right.
dye set into the fabric.
I see. Yes. Okay. And then you've got the third fruit of the oak, and I used to notice this on the oak I grew up in. So I forget what time of year it is. I think it's late summer. You get these sugars accumulating on the leaves, and people would, like, have you ever touched a deciduous oak leaf and it's kind of sticky?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's kind of like a sugary, kind of like honey, maple syrupy veneer on these leaves, and people would take the leaves and soak the leaves in water to make a kind of sugary water, and then they'd drink it or make an alcoholic beverage out of it. In fact,
Ah.
oak leaf wine was pretty common as well, but not. I don't think it was from those sugars. Oak leaf wine was, they would pick the young spring leaves with lots of sugars in them and use them to make wines out of.
I never have heard about that. So, Byron, another aspect of oaks that we haven't touched on is the symbolism or the cultural significance of these trees. Could you share some of that with our listeners today?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how the symbolism extends outside of Europe, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was very similar. But the like I mentioned before, oaks in traditional European symbolism have long symbolized robustness and abundance. This ability, this the grand oak, the old oak, this kind of like immutable, unmovable force with its deep roots in the ground, this ancientness, this kind of like king of the forest kind of vibe, ruled by Jupiter in the those astrological systems of correspondence. It's ruled by Jupiter. It's good luck. It's very positive. It provides. It's bountiful.
Mhm. And wisdom, I think, too, right? Like the
Yeah,
wise oak.
yeah. From its age and an association with Jupiter and Zeus and Thor because of it being struck by lightning so often. Um, so yeah, the Druids, like it's it's fascinating. We have to understand that pre-Christian Europe were a tree worshipping, might not be the right word, but revering culture, and that the Ogham, which is the 22-letter sacred alphabet of the what we call Druidic Celtic cultures, each 22 letters was named for a tree, the oak just being one of them. But Druid actually means Daruid, which is Daru is one of the Indo-European root words for what we call oak, and is also, I think, etymologically linked to the word door. So Daru is oak, and Wid means one who knows. So the Druids, the Daruids, are those who know the oak. These sacred these sacred groves throughout pre-Christian Europe, they were the churches of the ancestors of European peoples. The European peoples were as indigenous as anyone before the Romans come along. I'd direct people to a book written by a woman called Ly De Angelis. That's her name. It's Ly
Mm-hmm.
is her first name, and then De Angelis, De Angelis, like Los Angeles. And she wrote a book called Brittany, Priteni, and that is the root word of Britain, and it's about the Roman conquest of Britain, and gives an idea of the type of people that they're British, and very likely much of the Western European people, Celtic peoples, and Teutonic peoples, the Germanic Teutons in the northwest were before the Roman conquest. It's all tied together, You've got this growing appreciation for that as well at the moment. I'm noticing around the world, kind of the European collective identity is asking itself, who are we and what were we before, and what was this big event that changed us? And yeah, so that it kind of, to me, the oak is a symbol of our indigenousness as Western European people, and the nobility that comes along with that. And of course, you can have a people who are very, very deeply connected to their landscape and incredibly learned, and appreciating higher learning and higher wisdom in the forms of the kind of mystery schools of the Western Hermetic traditions that once upon a time were actually in the ground and alive and working, and be very fierce as well, very fierce warriors.
Yes, I read about that. Is there anything else you want to add about the sacred aspect of oaks?
I think I've said it all. I mean, we've got the druidic stuff, and then the symbolism, and then the way I feel about them, what they represent, and using them to move forward. Like, to me, that they are the symbol of the type of systems that I would like humanity to see implementing. And like, for instance, I was just watching TV this morning, and there's a Australian science program called Catalyst, and they've got this episode coming on tomorrow about the future of food, and it was all test tubes and laboratory grown meat and hydroponic vegetables, and nothing about regenerative agriculture or keyline or permaculture or holistic management or any call to a wiser land management as a response to crisis, or not even as a response to crisis, just being good stewards. It's like, how are we going to fix it? Well, Tesla cars and hydroponic lamb. It's like, no, that's not it. I'm sorry. Like, I know everyone's got their idea of what the future is going to look like, and I don't know what it is going to look like, but I've got a fairly confident idea of what I think we should be focusing on. And that's not to be Luddites and throw out any like technology and I mean, you can't fight progress, right? But let's start with our foundations. And I have an axiom that I live by, that ecology is the foundation of agriculture, and that agriculture is the foundation of culture. Because you're not going to have a culture unless you can feed yourself or clothe yourself, food, fiber, energy, shelter, water, all those things that agriculture means. And you're not going to have an agriculture if you don't have an ecology, because it is agriculture is an ecological enterprise. It's the human interface with the environment. And then, so if we're going into this future where it's increasingly uncertain, we don't know what's going on, there's all these vectors appearing and issues and crises popping up. On the one hand, it's all very negative. On the other hand, we have all these amazing technologies, which could be positive or negative depending on their application. But let's just say, like, okay, even if we're moving forward in some kind of tech future, let's take care of the foundations, the ecology and the agriculture. So to me, like, the ideal human future isn't going to be all stainless steel buildings and flying cars, and they may be there, and it's not going to even be like really novel, exotic food production technologies, buildings with algae on them producing electricity, or growing meat in test tubes. It's going to be like good old-fashioned plant and animal systems on well-designed land, just good old biological systems, but done in a way that encompasses everything we've learnt so far through trial and error and tragedy, to create these broad-scale, human-friendly, environmentally regenerative agricultural systems. That's what the oak represents to me.
And the oak, it sounds like, has a role in these systems.
It does, yeah.
So Byron, if people want to read more about you and read more of your articles and learn about your work, where can they find you online?
My website is the primary place, which is oaktreedesigns.com.au, and there's contact, and there's a bio, and there's articles and media and that kind of stuff. And yeah, I do consultancy and design and education. I'm based in southwestern Australia, but I'm very fortunate that my work takes me around Australia and the world at large, in fact, which I'm very grateful for. Listeners may have picked up on the fact that I have a particular interest in the Mediterranean climate regions of the world, including the Mediterranean basin, Southern Europe, North Africa, California, South Africa, and parts of Chile, and here, where I'm from, southwestern and southeastern Australia. That's me.
So Byron, we're at the end of our time together. Is there anything else you'd want listeners to know about oaks or your work?
Not really. Just send me money.
Me too.
Hashtag send me money. Hashtag send cash.
PayPal. We both take PayPal.
I'm sick of eating acorns.
Thank you so much, Byron, for joining us today to talk about oaks.
You're welcome. The pleasure was all mine. Thanks, Jill.
Thanks for listening to The Plant Report. The Plant Report is produced by Jill Cloutier and is a project of Sustainable World Radio. For more podcasts about plants, permaculture, and ecology, visit our website, sustainableworldradio.com, and you can also find us on iTunes, Facebook, and Twitter. The Plant Report is created for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any health condition. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to thank the plants for everything they do.